Here we are at a great turning. Here in Sacramento, just a few days ago, as I mentioned, we had rain. Not enough to make any dent, really, in our severe drought, but enough to remember rain is possible. We celebrate the turning, the rotating earth. We welcome the fall season. We mark the turning of a worship season this morning. Last week, Reverend Elizabeth Griswold and family returned for an in-person goodbye. And we needed that since Reverend Elizabeth her ministry ended with us while we were deep in quarantine last August. And she and her husband, Rabbi Seth Castleman, they closed out our Christian Folks and Folklore series with sermon, story, and wisdom from their traditions. And today, we launch a slow and profoundly difficult, great turning toward our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, our family members, and fellow citizens who are ideologically on the other side of the proverbial fence. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, I'm still undecided, for most of us, the fence does not separate us religiously. Many of us on both sides of the fence call ourselves Christian. It's hard to call yourself a Christian without reckoning with Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So, what do we do with the great ideological divide in our country? And believe me, I wanted to ignore it, but it kept on pestering me. How do we turn toward one another, human to human, when what we really might want to do, and I'm saying this for me mostly, is disengage, turn away with these parting words under our breath? I just can't anymore. I'm over it. Or maybe more extreme, you're insane. Do not speak to me again. We're tempted to lose it, to blow up, to cut ties, or maybe even worse, to secretly unfriend, delete the contact info, ignore, dismiss, and tell ourselves that we're justified in doing so. Are you with me? Before we get to what Jesus has to say about all of this, I want to say a few things so that I'm not misunderstood. I may be misunderstood anyway, but that's okay. We're in conversation, right? Turning toward one another across the fence is not about passively accepting the other's ideas. It's not about finding common ground. Though we might find some, it's not about going along to get along. Those sorts of postures are not actually turning toward each other. They're versions of, I just can't anymore. But watch me pretend like I'm paying attention. And as we move deeper into this worship series, and it's a long one, it's all the way until Advent begins, we will explore this more. However, I want to now say at the onset that turning toward one another across the chasm of what impasse level disagreement, I'm going to say that again, turning toward one another across the chasm of impasse level disagreement is not a good idea in every case. Context is everything. And we're going to talk more about like discerning the when, the where, and the how in the upcoming weeks. The engagement must occur with both parties on relatively equal footing. Like context, power is everything, and it matters in these kinds of engagements. Turning toward a human sibling from across a great divide is a bold and courageous refusal to see the other as less than human. A refusal to see the other as despicable, beyond the reach of God's grace. It's a refusal to see the other as incapable of bearing God's image, no matter what. Turning toward one another across a divide so deep and wide that we can barely see each other across it costs something. And we are not all in the same position to afford the cost, and that's okay. Because it's not about any one individual one of us. Not everyone is meant to turn toward in the same way or to the same degree or at the same time. We are a people, not an individual person, and so there's plenty of room to step up and step back as one's internal wisdom counsels us. But what we are not given, at least as Christians, is the opportunity to opt out. Love requires us to put ourselves on the line, to have skin in the game, as they say, to see each human, especially those across the fence, as worthy of respect, bearers of the divine image, and as our siblings. Trust me, I do not really want to hear this either. And yet I know, as you do too, that the cost of checking out or devolving into some sort of resentment or hatred or bitterness, that cost is so much greater. Not just for our individual hearts and our souls and our minds, but for the world's as well. So I hoped that I could make this sermon poetic or prophetic or exciting or sexy in some way. It's the beginning of this new worship series, and I tried so hard, I promise. But instead, it's more like a return to the basics. Like when you or your child wants to learn to play baseball. Where do you start? You go outside and you play catch, right? Over and over again, back and forth, throwing the ball, catching the ball. And then you watch the pros who have been playing baseball for as long as they can remember. And they're warming up on national TV to play this big game. And what are they doing? They're playing catch, throwing the ball back and forth, getting those muscles warmed up. And you know that in their mind's ear, they're hearing the chorus of all the coaches that they've had over the years. Those words like, eyes on the ball, look where you're throwing, watch your feet. The absolute basics. Go Giants. I couldn't resist that. I think there are a few folks who are over the fence, the baseball fence from me, and you can yell back at me. It's okay, even if you're online, it's only fair. To the divided and diverse Jewish audience that was listening to Jesus preach the most famous sermon ever delivered, the Sermon on the Mount, from which today's scripture is taken. What Jesus had to say may have seemed new to them, those listeners. But it's 2,000 years later, friends. And we can't say that anymore. For those of us who identify as Christian, regardless of which side of the ideological fence we're on, the Sermon on the Mount is the basics. It's the handbook for how to live the Christian life. And we must honor and remember, whenever we read this text, that the Christian life finds its beginnings in the deep religious well of Judaism. Our text this morning, it is a slice of the sermon that's situated within what many Christian scholars have called the antithesis, or the antithesis thesis. The language pattern goes like this. Jesus says, "You heard it said," and then Jesus quotes a commandment from the Torah. And then he follows that up with, "But I tell you," and he offers his teaching. And you can see how framing this pattern as antithesis tends to support anti-Semitism. Because if Jesus rejects his own tradition, then many people have gotten the idea that we're entitled as Christians to reject Judaism and Jews. On this point, I am on the other side of the fence. And I think actually that reading these texts as antithesis does not at all serve the meaning in Jesus' message. Jesus did then what all rabbis did and still do today. He entered a dialogue with his own tradition to see if he could get closer to God's intentions for his people in his time. So in essence, he said, let's start with the basics. Let's strip away layer upon layer of interpretation to get at the heart of the basic principles of the spiritual life. And then let's discover how that teaching, that basic teaching, meets the playing field and the opponent that we are scheduled to meet in our time and in our place. So in our text, as Tammy read, Jesus says, "You've heard it was said, you should love your neighbor, but hate your enemy." The love your neighbor part comes from Leviticus 19. Neighbors would have been understood as fellow Jews in Leviticus and also in Jesus' time. In case you're wondering, just a few verses away, Leviticus is clear about loving the stranger, the alien, the immigrant as well. There's a distinction between neighbor, fellow Jew, and alien or immigrant, but both are to be loved. The second part of Jesus' words, the hate your enemy part, isn't in the Torah. Something like it is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were a collection of Jewish texts that included rabbinical writings much more contemporary to Jesus' time. In Jesus' time, like today, there were deep divisions between people. What they had in common was an enemy. Who was the enemy to Jews in Jesus' time? Rome. Romans. Any representative of Rome. But there were very different ideas within the community on how to deal with this enemy. And those different ideas drew dividing lines between people. And those lines grew into chasms between people, separating households, separating longtime friends, separating entire faith communities. And as you might guess, those lines were exploited by crafty, power-mongering leaders because they knew that when you can separate struggling people from other struggling people, nothing suits the needs of empire better than that. Jesus knew that too. So Jesus adds a radical extension to the teaching. He says, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you might be children of your parent who is in heaven. For God makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what good is that?" Then he names a few unfaithful people, like tax collectors and Gentiles. They're quite capable of loving those who love them. Jesus' rationale for loving enemies is connected to God's love, agape. Dr. King calls agape love redemptive goodwill toward all humankind. We're down to the basics. Jesus and Dr. King's understanding of these basic principles of faith is that they're meant to lead us into living a higher way. Our lifetime of practicing faith and spirituality is meant to lead us into embodying God's love in this realm with one another. These are the basics. These are the building blocks. For the Christian, this is playing catch on the ball field. Sometimes, though, we have to practice over and over and over and over again. Love my enemies. Pray for those who persecute me. Now, I know as I stand here and say these words about loving enemies, and how many times have I wished that those words were not in the Bible? As I stand here and say these words, which are the core pillars of our faith, we stand in a 20-year shadow following 9/11/2001. Those of us who were old enough remember exactly where we were when we heard or when we saw the news of passenger planes used as weapons of mass destruction. Do you remember where you were? We still remember the gut punch that we felt. We remember the ensuing 20-year war, which killed countless Iraqi and Afghani people, along with many U.S. soldiers. When we stand here and we say, love your enemies, we say that after 933 people have been shot and killed by police in our country just in 2021. Grossly disproportionate are police killings of Black and brown people. We're making some progress, but we still have a long ways to go toward a culture of accountability when the gun is in police hands. As we say these words, love your enemies, we say those words just days after a brutal murder in Inland Park. A 61-year-old Kate Tibbetts and her 2 dogs were murdered during what should have been a quiet evening at home. We say Jesus' words, love your enemies, after tragedies in your life, where people have deeply hurt you, or people close to you. Rajiv mentioned a very recent tragedy among our own beloveds, our former student and family friend, who, while living his best life, was hit by a car while jogging. We say these words, love your enemies, after a mob stormed the Capitol building, intent on hurting elected leaders, intent on destroying our democracy. And we say these words, love your enemy, from one or the other side of an ideological and political divide in our country. A divide that separates neighbor from neighbor, friend from friend, family member from family member. And as I mentioned earlier, I am not advocating for bridge building or crossing over to the other side. Please hear me on that. The divide is there. It should be there. The divide has a purpose in our times. It has an important role to play in our life together in this moment. And it's not fun and it's not comfortable. But it's essential to whatever will become, whatever is next. And each one of us at this moment, we're sort of forced to decide where we stand on many issues. It's not so easy to sort of play both sides anymore. We must choose our side. There are some basic things that are not up for debate. Things like human rights. So loving your enemy is not about making friends out of enemies. Though if friendship were possible, it would certainly follow love. Loving our enemies, praying for our persecutors, has little to do with granting anyone a free pass. It's about acknowledging the reality of what is different between us, of what is moral and immoral as we see it, of listening to one another and deciding that no matter what, I will see my adversary as a human being. Why? Because God sees them as a human being, worthy of love. Loving enemies is one of the most basic principles of our faith, and it's the foundation of our faith's approach to nonviolent direct action in the world. If we can't love our enemies, can we believe that there is a divine loving presence in the universe that connects us all together? Isn't this belief in this all-encompassing love both our hope and our salvation? I close with Dr. King's words, who had a lot to say about this durable strength of love. And I quote, "I am certain that Jesus understood the difficulty inherent in the act of loving one's enemy. He never joined the ranks of those who talk glibly about the easiness of the moral life. He realized that every genuine expression of love grows out of a consistent and total surrender to God. So when Jesus said, 'Love your enemy,' he was not unmindful of its stringent qualities, yet he meant every word of it. Our responsibility as Christians is to discover the meaning of this command and seek passionately to live it out in our daily lives. Amen."